All right, everybody, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jennifer Drake-Croft, and I'm the Director of Child Wellbeing at the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth and a member of the Building Strong Brains Tennessee Lunch and Learn Content Planning Committee. We welcome each of you to the Building Strong Brains Tennessee Lunch and Learn series. Since its inception, Building Strong Brains Tennessee has connected brain science and communication science to change the culture in Tennessee to be informed by ACEs, trauma, and resilience. This culture change has prompted many professionals, communities, and philanthropists to use the latest brain science to better prevent, and mitigate ACEs, trauma, and toxic stress. 4 years of comprehensive, coordinated, and collective work from both the private and public sectors have positioned Tennessee as a national leader in ACEs response. With your leadership and collaboration, we hope this Lunch and Learn series will propel and expand cutting-edge work as we support professionals and community members to learn from innovative efforts happening at the national and local levels. We also hope that participants will consider ways to promote more equitable communities for all children and families. We remind everyone that you are on mute and will be unable to unmute yourself. Please post questions in the chat box, not the Q&A box, for the presenters' responses at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth YouTube page. Finally, please fill out the survey that pops up at the end of the webinar and let us know if you would be interested in joining a learning community addressing today's topic area. We thank the Tennessee chapter of the National Association of Social Workers for providing CEUs for this event. We will email attendees of the live webinar a certificate of attendance following the presentation. Also, our presenter has generously given us permission to share a PDF version of her slides, and we will be emailing those as well. We thank Building Strong Brains Tennessee for sponsoring the event. If you are interested in receiving notice of future Building Strong Brains Lunch and Learn opportunities, please email Jennifer Drake-Croft, me, at jen.croft, C-R-O-F-T, @tn.gov. Now, we would like to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Christina Bethell. Dr. Bethell is a professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she advances a new integrated science of thriving to promote early and lifelong health of children, youth, families, and communities. Dr. Bethell is an avid student of human potential for flourishing amid adversity and focuses on promoting research and innovation in health, education, and social systems, policies, and practices to promote the social, emotional, and relational roots of well-being. She advances a positive construct of health that places self-awareness, relationships, mindfulness, and mind-body practices as key public health strategies, especially to address the developmental and collective trauma held by the majority of people, families, and communities today. Her work is focused on implementing a widely endorsed national agenda to address childhood trauma and promote healing and flourishing through research, advocacy, and teaching. She writes poetry, dances, and believes that attuned connection with ourselves, life, and others is the source of our creativity and joy. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Bethell. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you. I'm getting some feedback here. Are we good?
I think you're good to go.
Okay, great. I'm hearing, okay, the feedback's gone. Okay, I'll start over. Thank you for the invitation. And it's wonderful to be here. And I wish I could see everyone, but I have been trying to feel everyone as much as I can. And I know you're there. And I'm very happy that you're there. And I hope that I can contribute to you today in the work and leadership that you're engaged in around promoting flourishing and healing in your communities and your families and in all those you touch, as well as yourself. So just make sure I can move my slides. So the first thing is I just need to let you know I have no financial relationships to disclose or conflicts of interest to resolve as it relates to this talk. But I do want to disclose that I hold a model of health that is what the World Health Organization outlined in 1948, that health is really a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I would add to that that we have a strong science that shows even when we have illnesses and adversities, that we can actually still flourish. And I'm going to talk to you more about what I mean by that, some research, and the opportunity we have in this time to optimize our well-being while we meet the adversities and conflicts that are ours to meet today. So I think well-being is upon us because in many ways it's within and between us. We have science, our own deep lived experience and historical experience, and a set of policies now that are starting to allow resources and training to be directed toward translating the science of well-being and adversity and healing. And yet we still have to engage in that healing. So I say we are the medicine, and the cornerstone for that for me is that relational wounding, which is often where trauma emerges, and for the most part, that's what the neuroscience is focused on, is relational trauma, whether that's in the family or at a community level or a society level, that it requires relational healing. And I don't really come by this naively. I grew up a good chunk of my life in Southern California, in Los Angeles, low-income communities. And then I lived in Paradise, California, which was a small rural town that was, I think, the welfare capital of California at the time. And you may know Paradise by the town that completely burned down a couple years ago. And I've been working with Paradise and Butte County for the healing that they're trying to do. But when I lived there, I had a lot of adversities, like many people who grew up in that time and now today, but I looked good. I wrote poetry, I got good grades, I was involved in almost everything I could get my hands on. And here's a poem that I wrote that they actually put on the cover of the 8th grade poetry book. Because way out there where there is no end, there is a star who has no friend. He's not too big, he's not too tall, he's really not much of anything at all. Way out there where there is no end, you can go far away and find no friend. Way down here where there is an end, you can go far away and find no friend. So the fact that this was celebrated and somebody didn't ask me about it is a sign of how far we've actually come. I think today we use art and poetry with children to help understand where they're at and what their needs might be, especially for the bulk of children who experience trauma, who really try to be very hypervigilant, play by the rules, and are not the ones acting out. The children who act out, which is one end of the continuum of how trauma can play out, are really more attended to in many ways, and those that act in, if you will, are less. But I have a lot of hope. This is a picture on the right that I took when I went to Paradise after the fire. And it's now a community that is bringing art and healing and connection in the community to the traumas that they experienced through the fire, but have experienced actually collectively for many decades. And I think that's true for a lot of our communities. So I wanted to just share that story with you. So my objectives are to identify some opportunities and possibilities to promote flourishing even amid adversity, but it takes a whole child, whole family approach in this time, which is a unique time we're in right now, very stressful, but also time filled with opportunity. To consider strategies and skills that might be applicable to you to translate the science of flourishing into services, policy, and culture, and identify opportunities to leverage some existing programs and policies. This is actually a whole another talk about all the detailed things that we have in place right now that we could move and shift a little bit to be able to really advance our objectives in promoting well-being through adversity. So the first thing I want to say is we are rich with understanding what the ecosystem is that we need to build to take flourishing to scale. This is the sort of based on the Bronfenbrenner model that many of you may know about child development, that is now so supported by the neuroscience and epigenetic sciences and all of our other sciences. But the model of child development as being multi-layered and requiring a focus on the family and informal networks and the local environment, as well as the broader social environment, has been long understood and is up underneath a lot of the innovative work that's going on right now. We have the CDC, the AAP that have come out with policy statements, and all of it has led to this eco-bio-developmental model of human health and disease and well-being. I would edit some of this now, but this was at the beginning of their work that really recognizes the biology, which is often what we focus on in our systems, without really taking into account how our biology is impacted by our ecology and how all of that impacts our development. So that it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, but it's not even what's happened to you. It's how can we buffer that and help build resilience and flourishing despite the adversities that we experience, most all of us at some level. So I always get people saying, well, where can I make a difference? But when you really look at these models of what we know about human development and child development, it's really everywhere. So there's distal influences like income and resources and social policy and promoting cultures of cohesion and physical environments that support life and make it easy to do the right thing, like move around and exercise and be safe. There's proximal influences with families directly in the schools where they live and play every day, peer influences, and primary outcomes that we measure related to that have been mostly around the reduction of bad things. You'll notice this is the model that we kind of work on. But what I'm going to be talking about is going beyond just looking at competencies and things that we often measure, but really looking at the broader concept of flourishing. But for the most part, wherever you sit and wherever you are, you matter and the opportunity is everywhere. So I mentioned, what do we face in this time? And what we face are multiple levels of adversity, but with a very strong growing awareness of research that links the stress and trauma and adversity to brain body identity development, which is huge, obviously, to health across life. And at the same time, studies all the possibilities for buffering that, because there's huge variation in how children, families, and communities do who are exposed to trauma. And so we know there's something we can do about it. But just acknowledging that what we see at the household level, which is how we typically assess ACEs, is often rooted in a wide array of community level, historical, and deeply entrenched systemic issues that relate to opportunities for jobs and education and a growing historical trauma. And we know that history is not the past when it hasn't been integrated and met in the present for healing. And that's, I think, a lot of what we are up against. So we have the climate crisis, and adding to this, the COVID-19 pandemic. The world has been filled with these types of threats all the time. And yet the climate crisis, obviously, depending on your understanding of it, is a new piece that brings it very, very global. But we do know a lot about thriving in this time. But it does take speaking truth, whether it's at the individual level of what you've been through, that healing through revealing is a well understood concept, that truth and reconciliation are the first place we start when we want to start to heal with each other, in our communities, or in our families. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of opportunity and enough safety where we can speak openly about what's been there so that we have the opportunity to really meet it squarely and heal. So I'm both inspired as much as I am deeply sad about the history that we've had in this country around racism, around ignoring our whole health, our social emotional container, and how much we really can have an opportunity to change that now. So a term I often use is the resistance to the disturbance is the disturbance, that we know when we can make present what we've made absent, that's where the opportunity begins. So this was a recent last week ACEs Connection article about police getting together with community members, and a young, well, I don't know how young he is, but a young man, or a man, he looks young to me, said, I don't even know his name, meaning the policeman, but he apologized for what had happened to me when I was 17. And all the time, all I ever needed was an apology. And this just speaks to me about the power of that hearing, listening, and that healing through revealing capacity that we all have today. So I think that that's very inspiring for me. And it's also mapping to the science that really shows that trauma is held experience that wasn't spoken or integrated or buffered. So it reminds me of a river eddy. It's just sort of not allowing the water to keep flowing. So when we meet it, we can unhinge and allow the life to move on. But it's more than speaking our truth. It's also a very big opportunity to continue to make present what we have made absent, if that makes sense, because that's really our work, is to acknowledge what hasn't been met. So when I look at the COVID-19 crisis and the stress that it might bring up, for those who've had trauma in the past, it could hook into that trauma and bring that up as well. So we have this opportunity right now to link the trauma we're in now with past trauma and meet it with a healing response when it may not have been met with a healing response before. So new traumas and new stresses hook into old experiences that are not yet healed. So if we look carefully and respond carefully from a healing place, we have the opportunity to link this trauma to a healing response for the unintegrated and unmet traumas that communities experience and that children and families experience. But it takes systems change. So we can talk and all that, but we do have to actually change the conditions that have allowed this to transpire. And many health systems and public health departments and social systems and educational systems are well underway by being able to create that ability to see ourselves and see the system and really change from the mindset and the mental models, which really hold that in place, all the way up to the policies and practices and resource flows is the goal. But what's in the middle of those two mental models, getting people to understand the need, the possibility to shift their aspirations and intentions to get on board with the kind of change, to translate that into policy, practice, and resources, we have to work with our relationships and our connections and power dynamics. And that's a lot of what I see happening in society today, and really am hoping that we take this opportunity to create the systems change that we've been striving for decades who've come before us. There's a model at MIT for management and systems change that they use globally. It's called Theory U. And you'll look here, and it requires an open mind, an open heart, and an open will to see what will emerge when we start to allow our current past patterns and mindsets to be suspended enough to see with fresh eyes, to redirect our attention to listening to other people and who may think differently, what might be possible, and letting go into a new possibility at the bottom of this U. And really looking at our own selves in that, because so much of what transpires in our world has to do with the individuals, obviously, that are present at that time. So then we can move in quickly into prototyping new models and be in a learning approach to do rapid cycle learning and engagement. And when systems change, whether it's a culture or a business or a company where this has been used, it's very effective. But a lot of people want to jump right over that process and just talk at this top level of, okay, we know this problem, let's go right away to thinking about how we can change it. And we might have ideas about what the change we want to arrive at, but we need to go through the process. And I think that's really the best thinking among systems change leaders in the entire world support this theory. And it's not just a theory, it's probably your lived experience as well, if you've ever been involved in such a change process in your life at any level. So this has led me to my 6 wishes for catalyzing what I call a We Are the Medicine paradigm shift, which is just really acknowledging that we personally and in groups, small and large, are the medicine that we need to make the shifts that we need and to heal with the support of systems change. And the first to create systems change would be what I call free our brilliance. And I'm linking this to some neuroscience concepts. By aligning our reward systems, what we get paid for, what we get acknowledged for, and finance to our values for health in this positive health construct. The next is to take on transparency, where we start to see clearly and plainly what is now versus where we want to go, and find ways to constantly get that feedback loop. So embed a healthy, alert, and continuous feedback system into our efforts so that we can do the launching of our innovations with the learning in real time and not get stuck with systems for change that might not even be as good as what we started with. To become we ninjas. So this is my shorthand for saying, you know, we don't really have a long history of, even in research, successful community partnerships and leadership change models. They often are based on a person or a set of funding that then goes. And so really to embed at a deep level these skills for collaboration and partnership and what that means for how we enter into spaces together and create the possibilities for going through that you that I talked about, so we can fully engage the affiliative system to go from what I call fixing to connecting. And without that, we will fail. And I think all of us can see examples in our life where we talked about what we wanted and maybe collaborations, but it didn't happen because of the relationship breakdowns. And that's true for medical errors as well. Studies all come down to how people are communicating and working together among themselves day by day and one-on-one and in small groups. So my next wish is to make sure that whatever we do, we focus on the positive health opportunities we're trying to achieve. And in doing that, we face adversity, we face illness, but we do it with an aim toward promoting positive health and not just trying to get rid of something bad. It's very important, I think, that we embed an unstoppable habit of hope and optimism and face the fact that a lot of people and individuals and even children today do not report high levels of hope, sense of belonging, and that we can address that through meeting it and through acknowledging it. It begins to transform in and of itself. And then we're in a safe place to take on the trauma, to really talk about it, to acknowledge it, to recognize that it's not what's wrong with us, it's what's happened to us, and that we do have a need to change the beliefs that got constructed and our identities that got constructed at the individual level, the family level, the community level, and society about what we thought was possible or not, and to learn new skills that we didn't learn before, either because they weren't modeled or we just really were too busy just surviving. So we really need to restore this relational safety, trust, and skills for healing. And in my mind, the last wish is to brave being, because it's the moment by moment interactions that dictate a lot of what's going to happen in our brains and our bodies to turn the tide on the trauma for us as we embed it in our bodies and in our minds and in our identities and then in our families and communities. So I have a lot to say about creating a your being, their well-being approach, where your well-being as a person interacting with children, youth, and families, or leading organizations is absolutely essential for any sustained improvement in health and flourishing. So that's my punchline. And then I want to share a little bit more now about the research that's behind all of this. And I'm going to go quickly through some slides for you that you'll get later. So I'm not expecting you to look at all of them. They're mostly visual cues, but I want to make sure that you have this data. You can refer to it. I ran some new data for Tennessee. So it's the latest we have nationally and at your state level about the topics I'm going to talk about. So what's possible despite what we face? First, we have to see what we face. We do have high ACEs loads. And we know that we're increasing our death rates, especially in this country compared to other countries, from the diseases of despair, where we have to start to redefine better off, where even upper income, middle-aged people and men in this country are dying at higher rates from other countries. And it's due to alcohol, drug, smoking, the things we do to soothe our nervous systems when we aren't getting our real needs met. And that's what's happening at the adult level. But I asked the question, what about children, about in 2001? And it took us till 2011 and 12 to actually get the answer to that, about the prevalence of ACEs in our states and in our communities. So for Tennessee, it's about 52.6% without any of the ACEs that are assessed. And this doesn't include every community ACE, but it does include responses to questions about racism and a response to questions about neighborhood and community violence. So this is some of your data that you can look at more, and I've given you a link here where you can get your own state fact sheet. But I'm going to just summarize a little bit of the findings more for you quickly. So by the numbers, I always like to say how many school buses would be lined up filled with children in Tennessee that have 1 or 2 ACEs, and it's about 96 miles with 1 ACE or more, and 45, almost 46 miles for 2 or more. I don't know how far that goes in your state, but you would know that. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. So people have a sense that this isn't a small number of our children. And when we look at the data, this is in the fact sheet, so you can look at it more carefully. We look at chronic condition prevalence, having an emotional, mental, behavioral problem, being overweight or obese, being bullied or excluded, mother's mental health, which is so key to children, whether children are engaged in school or meeting these flourishing criteria, or whether families stay hopeful, we see systematically between no ACEs and higher ACEs a differential that is alarming. So we know that if we can focus on children with these exposures, we are going to make a difference in not only the health of our population now, but the health of these children's precious lives and for our future population. And it is all of us. It is true that this is not equitable, but once children are exposed to ACEs, it is equally unequal in the sense that even at higher income levels, the biological impact and the impact on school engagement and all these other factors is fairly similar. So here we see that the rate of emotional mental behavioral problems for children with 4 or more ACEs by income ranging from 45.4 to 53.7. And compared to other differentials by income, this is a fairly narrow gap. So in my mind, this is about all of us, and yet we need to focus on the most vulnerable as well. So shining a light on ACEs is more than a courtesy alert. We know that. We have protective factor opportunities. There's models for looking at ACEs now that are coming out more and more for pediatrics and children that do integrate resilience and positive health into the assessment of ACEs. So a little bit more about the promise. So some of you may have seen this article on family resilience and connection promoting flourishing among children, even amid adversity. I was almost embarrassed by the title because it's instinctive, right? But we have to measure it and study it and document it at a population level to get the attention of policymakers and health systems and schools. So that's what we did. And it took about 20 something years to get all the variables in the same place to be able to do this study. And the bottom line is that we documented once again that health does operate on a dual continuum, that the absence of illness and adversity does not equal positive health. You're going to see that many children without ACEs, without social determinants, risk factors, also are not flourishing in this country. When a large group is not flourishing, I believe that none of us really can flourish, that we're in this together. And the science of flourishing is going to show us that we all have work to do wherever we are, and that even among those with high levels of adversity, social and ACEs, and along the lines of all the things we talked about up till now, many do flourish by virtue of the way that their families and communities are able to and supported to respond to that adversity. So we have the dual continuum, and I'm going to ask you right now to just look at these questions on the right, which is a scale for adults to assess their own flourishing. And there's a lot more research behind this that I can share with you. But my question to you is, can you flourish within the adversities that we're all facing today? Can you lead a purposeful and meaningful life today, even though it's difficult? Can you foster social relationships that are supportive and rewarding? Stay engaged and interested in your daily activities. Actively contribute to the happiness and well-being of others to the extent that you can. Feel that you're growing your competence and you have a capability, that you have something to offer that's important to you, and that you can maintain optimism even amid this challenge, and that you feel that people respect you. This is important. If you don't feel people respect you and you belong, it can unend all of those other qualities of flourishing very powerfully, because that's our most important need. So this issue of racism and being in other places where people are othered is an incredibly big hit to flourishing. But I would say that many people today, amid the adversity, are able to answer these things positively, and therefore would be considered to flourish amid the adversity and even grow their possibilities for flourishing by meeting what's here today. But how about our children? We don't measure it the same way for children because they're developing, but we do look at whether children are curious and interested in learning new things as an indicator of flourishing, whether they can persist and complete tasks that they choose to begin, and whether they stay calm and in control when faced with everyday challenges versus collapsing or acting out strongly. And this was done through a whole process more explained in that paper. I'm heartened by Harvard Business Review also picking these qualities as the main qualities of successful leaders: being curious, staying engaged, being determined. And many schools are in the business now of promoting these qualities of curiosity, emotion, awareness, and regulation and persistence in the face of challenge. For Tennessee, this is just for 12 to 17-year-olds. I have the data for other ages as well, but I wanted to profile this. About 46% of all the children in your state meet all three of these criteria. If we added more criteria, the rate would just go down. About 25% two or more. But really, it's only when children meet all three do we see the big improvements in school engagement and other outcomes. And here's the diversity that we see nationally. And again, even though there are differences, it's actually clear that it's a problem for all population groups. So even for over 400% of poverty, we have only a little over half of children meeting these criteria. So that's where we have there. And of course, ACEs, with ACEs, flourishing goes down, but you still see some with high ACEs still flourishing. So I like to look at the positive deviance and dive into that a lot. And when we see what it's about, it has a lot to do with family resilience and connection, which in turn has a lot to do with how they're met in the system, the quality of the services they receive, and the context that they're in. So that's a train I can't go all the way down with you today, but I want to make sure I said that. So here we can see that the higher the score on this family resilience and connection index, the higher the probability children flourish, even amid ACEs. So we've adjusted for that. And this is a graph you probably are going to want to study a little more later, but it's all just to say, if I stratify that analysis for children with 4 or more ACEs, 2 to 3 ACEs, 1 ACE or none, the variation is very similar. So these are odds ratios that calculate that. And I'd be happy to explain this more, but it's just to say that the effect of family resilience and connection is similarly impactful regardless of your ACEs status. So if you have no ACEs, but not strong family resilience and connection, you're also very unlikely to be flourishing. It's stronger if you have high ACEs, but it's very, very important to recognize this. So only about 25% of all US children have both meeting flourishing criteria and have families who meet 4 to 6 of the criteria for family resilience and connection. That means 75% of our children have some level of concern around this analysis. So luckily, we have a lot of data on resilience that puts relationships at the core. Again, we are the medicine. So I'm going to share just a little bit more about this aspect so that I can contextualize it a little deeper. Some of you may know about our article in JAMA Pediatrics from this last year on positive childhood experiences. So we have PIECES and ACEs, and if we combine both of them and analyze the data, it's a powerful way to understand opportunities for helping children with ACEs and ourselves. But we're looking here at positive childhood experiences, just the way we do with ACEs, looking back on your life, and finding that adults are much less likely to experience depression or have relational health problems and not be getting the social support they need if they also have positive childhood experiences. So the punchline is that when children experience positive experiences, and this is from the initial ACEs study, they did measure some of these family strengths, but it has been very rarely studied. And this is long ago. So we're building this to try to renew it. But this graph is from a paper that I've referenced right here that shows that when family strengths increase, adolescent pregnancy goes far down, even with children with ACEs. It's a very high level study, so we wanted to deepen it. And these were the positive experiences that we were talking about. Feeling able to talk about your family, about feelings, being stood by in difficult times, enjoying participating in community traditions, feeling a sense of belonging in high school, feeling supported by friends, having at least 2 non-parent adults who take genuine interest, feeling safe and protected. This was a very strong indicator. We actually formulated it and tested it for the study, and there's more in the paper on that. But what we found is that adults that report more positive experiences looking back on their lives were twice as likely to report receiving the social and emotional support as adults. The findings were very robust and replicated at every level of ACEs. We also found that those who had more of these positive experiences versus fewer when we compare 0 to 2 with 6 to 7, there was a 72% lower odds of having depression or poor mental health as an adult. And then if we look for even 3 to 4 versus 6 to 7, 50% lower odds. So it's very strong. Again, the higher levels are important, just like with family resilience and connection. And what you might notice about these, and this is just a quick graph showing the results at the for depression and mental health problems at the item level, is that a lot of these items are about how we're met when things are hard. So feeling supported, being able to talk about things when things are hard actually turns out to be one of the strongest positive experiences we can have. So in this time of struggle, how we meet each other makes a big, big difference. So we have other research looking at the importance of helping families and mothers gain their own abilities to look at their own histories of trauma and build their own sense of being able to manage stress. And when that doesn't happen, children don't do as well. They're less likely to have resilience. But when they do have resilience, even with ACEs, they're much less likely to go on to have a diagnosis of a mental, emotional, behavioral problem. And many of you know that the diagnoses for things like ADHD or anxiety or depression overlap a lot with the symptoms of trauma. So teaching resilience, it can be taught. It's not a trait. It's something we can learn. And when we do, we see much lower rates of having mental, emotional, or behavioral problems. Same thing with school engagement. And I'm just going to let you look at this later, but the bars tell you the story. And then we know about a growth mindset, which is basically just teaching young people that, you can grow and change. Your brain is plastic. Your core identity is your core identity, and you can feel yourself in there. But the things that happen and the ideas that you formulate and the habits that you build based on that can shift. And so just knowing that was very much a big predictor for increasing symptoms of depression in this randomized trial that was done. And the results remained for over a year, just teaching in a very simple way that you can grow and change and to have a growth mindset. So I think we have a very, very big opportunity, but we might have a hard, easy cognitive bias where we take things more seriously when they involve medications or complex interventions, when really we can do something now by just helping everyone learn about the possibilities for healing and growth. We took this a little further in a new study that'll be coming out. And again, this is for your later perusal for the details, but we wanted to look at medical health risks that we often focus on, like chronic conditions and functional difficulties, looking at social risks related to food insecurity, neighborhood safety issues, racism, and then relational health risks that were really more at the family level, and these ACEs that are at the family level, and also parental well-being and aggravation and stress. And how did they play together? And what we found was that the probability that a child has a mental, emotional, behavioral condition, and the reason I'm calling this out is because it's at epidemic levels in many of our communities, and it prevents healthy learning and well-being across life, of course. So what we see is if there's no relational risk, but at every level of social risk, there is a higher level of mental, emotional, behavioral conditions. But when you have more relational risk, that's where you really see a bump up. And so the relational risks continue to really trump everything in terms of being where we need to make sure we don't neglect to focus. With 63% of children in this study having, which is a national study, and we have data for every state too, experiencing a mental, emotional, or behavioral diagnosis that's been identified by a provider that's not even looking at risks, once they have 2 to 4 relational risks and 2 to 4 social risks. Without social risks, it was about 44%, which is also extremely high. So this means we want some whole person assessment. And we've been working on research along with others to try to transform well visits, because they are a paid for service, and it is an opportunity to learn. We have something called the Well Visit Planner that we continue to study that helps families on Bright Futures guidelines pick their priorities and help self-assess and reflect, so they come in and you can tailor the visit using relationship-centered and brief interventions and strong connections and referrals and linkages to the community with a post-assessment to give that continuous feedback. So there are other models, but this idea of engaging families so that we can actually meet their needs is critical. And it will also lead this awareness to maybe not diagnosing so quickly these emotional, mental, behavioral problems, but instead realize that the symptoms are based in trauma and that we can do something at a primary care level to start to address those before we just jump to a medical intervention. And this is very important and being increasingly studied as well. And the bottom line for all of this is that I call it C3, caregiver-child connection, ends up being over and over a very, very large factor, which you would expect given the science of attachment and how the issues of attachment play out. And that also then feeds into the community level issues. I'm not talking about what systems impose, that's different and also powerful, but we can do something now by strengthening parent-child connection, even around what's hard, because one of the best definitions is that you talk about things that really matter with your child is the way we measure this. And when that's high, we find that even among children with all three of those whole child complexity index domains, having medical problems, social problems, and relational health risks, that they're much more likely to flourish with parent-child connection. So it also means that we can take the time when we are connecting with families, if they are able to self-engage and we give them models to reflect and identify their needs, to move into teaching the practices that are very neuroscience based around what I call time in practices, time with practices, and time for practices, being very strongly supported by the research. And maybe we can talk more about this in the question and answer. So what does it all mean? Well, promoting positive relational experiences is critical. It's aligned with guidelines in the science. That it's all of us. Learning about positive experiences in the context of ACEs is important, and developing standardized measures that we can run alongside all of our measures of adversity and risk are critical. So we have a way to look at positive health, positive experiences, and proactively promote that, whether it's combined with adversity or not. Children who do not, and families who do not, and communities who do not display positive health factors of optimism, hope, self-agency, and other kinds of positive factors like being engaged and being connected, that we can proactively promote that right now. And I mentioned before that a big piece of this is you. Your being is very connected to the well-being of your clients, of your own family, as you know. I love this quote from the arts that one mistake the arts would never make is to presume that a part or a role can be exactly specified independent of the performer. So in this science of thriving, who we are and how we are moment by moment really, really matters. Everything we say and do creates an impact. Every interaction creates a reaction in our brains and bodies, and how we are with each other is very, very, very important. So we know a lot about this from polyvagal theory, and for those of you who could look at the science, but even how we hold our face, the tone of voice we use, our body language is sending signals of safety or not to everyone all the time, and we are all deeply impacted by that as adults and especially for children. And the research looking at what's successful in, say, primary care to address behavioral health and mental health issues, which is a huge focus. My colleague, Dr. Wisso, has studied this, and they came right down to it. And they said it's really about relationships. It's about whether the teens and the families that come in have a sense that we like each other as a team, that we're a safe place, and that they're safe with us. And then you can start talking about actually seeing positive outcomes. Same with school studies that look at effects of teacher-child closeness, which is, of course, really dependent on the stress that the teacher has and their ability to be supported themselves. So with teacher-child closeness at every level of risk, all of the outcome indicators in this study were improved. And again, the stress of the teacher and their ability to cope and the ways they're supported was highly predictive of that teacher-child connection. So we often think of burnout because we're dealing every day with this difficulty. And the study of compassion is growing, and many medical schools are centering their curriculum on it. And there's a book called Compassionomics, but there's many, many research articles it's based on. And the importance of offering compassion is really clear, that even 40 seconds of authentic seeing and just meeting what is of another person changes their nervous system, their brain functioning, their chemistry, if you will, that relates to stress. But it also changes the person offering it. And so there's a lot of people who talk about compassion fatigue, which I would think of as more overcare, thinking you have to fix it. So there's a continuum of undercare, care, and overcare. Would often you swing from overcare, I have to fix it, I can't, so I just don't connect at all, to just this place of care where we can hold and contain the difficulty even if we can't fix it, being that safe place of compassion. And when that happens, we also see that the teachers, the parents, the healthcare providers have their own body being regulated. So it's healthy for us to really, really lean into developing these qualities. So ultimately, we are the ecosystem. And in this we are the medicine approach, we need to focus on relationships first, build a caring and healing mindset and capacity. Definitely stay the course on systems change, bringing that capacity to our systems change efforts to foster enduring systems and culture change capacity that I talked about earlier. There are many models for this. And ultimately, to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're focused on prioritizing possibilities and measuring our success by positive health indicators and not just the removal of something bad, because they're not the same. We're fortunate that we have a lot of efforts going on. Jen mentioned our prioritizing possibilities agenda. We have a whole academic pediatrics that has a lot of community-based efforts discussed in it, and from families as well. We have a campaign for trauma-informed policy and practice that's working at the systems level for the city, county, state, and national policy level. And the state of California, this is work we did in California to help them use their marijuana tax money, because they have a lot of it, to make sure that they really actually create healing in communities most impacted by the war on drugs. Our agenda can be read, but it basically is what you would think, you know, so it's humbling what you have to go through to state an agenda. And at the other end, it looks very obvious, but it does need to happen to really, really go great guns on educating and translating the science of human development, flourishing, resilience, and ACEs, to cultivate conditions for cross-sector collaboration through data sharing, capacity, shared training and capacity development and relationships, and funding in a way that allows that. And fuel, launch, and learn efforts. So when you get grants, you can be able to look at what are the indicators the community values, the family's value, and learn as you go, and not be stuck to an intervention or stuck to a set of indicators just because that's what you have to do. So we have to change the way we fund our research, our innovations, our programs when we're in a learning mode, which we are in right now, and to ultimately restore and begin to reward for safe, stable, nurturing relationships in performance measures and in performance reporting of all kinds, to really reward for cultivating these qualities in ourselves and each other, in systems and in communities, to make our spaces safe and nurturing, even though we're dealing with a lot of adversity. It requires changes at every level, from coverage and coding to credentialing, where we need non-MD, non-licensed professionals are often the best to do some of the main work, but we might not even be able to pay them. So these are the kinds of details that I am interested in advancing and seeing best practices around the country. And the fundamental engine for change is the competent community. And I always put this one up first because it's from 1985, when I really started my work looking at community change. As a high school student, I was working with nursing home residents who I couldn't wheel to the park because there weren't any stairs. It was before the American with Disabilities Act, and I got really upset about it and went to the Chamber of Commerce and petitioned, and I counted the steps, and I did a survey of the residents, and eventually they changed it, and they started before the ADA to create ways that people with disabilities could get to the beautiful park, and I could wheel somebody through that, which would change their whole positive health. So I started pretty early trying to marry data and advocacy with systems change. But now we have newer models that are even more specific to the issues we face around adversity and creating a culture of health. This is the self-healing communities model. There's the building resilience communities model. Both of these are featured in that special issue of academic pediatrics I mentioned that we put together. So if you want to read more in depth, those are there. And we're lucky that we have now federal attention to this. The very first House Committee on Oversight and Reform did a hearing this last year. I was surprised they invited me to testify. It went on for 4 hours, but really it's the first time, and now we have so many bills. There are hundreds of bills now in the Congress being floated around, trying to integrate at every level of health, education, social services, and across the society and public health, an awareness of the science of ACEs, but really more than that, the science of healing and resilience and flourishing. So I want to end with just showing you this poster that's from 1919 at the very beginning of the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. And this is what they said. They said, don't worry about kids. No shock can mark an unborn baby. No horrible sight can deform him. Think about how far we've come. But it just says, but the mother should really not have any worry, fear, or anger, and must be very calm, happy, and sweet-tempered, because it might otherwise affect her milk, which would affect the baby. This was the state of the science back then. And imagine how far we've come. But have we translated how far we've come in our science and understanding into our systems? We have a long way to go, but I think we can go fast, especially since we're listening to each other more than we ever have. So we can go from trauma to interrupting trauma to healing and flourishing. And as I continue my work, I'll be focused on the mindsets to match that mandate, the metrics to match that mindset so that we can start keeping that feedback loop going, and the research. And then of course, the methods to move the metrics, the innovations that are coming out need to be moved along quickly. And I thank you so much for your attention today and look forward to some questions.
Dr. Bethell, that was amazing. You are the cutting edge of this science, and I so appreciate focusing on thriving and flourishing rather than focusing only on trauma, you know? We have a few questions that have come through. Some of them have come through directly to me. If you've sent any questions directly to Dr. Bethell, please do just copy and paste them to either everyone or to me. Just want to remind folks that joined us a little bit later. This was mentioned a few times throughout the presentation with the slides, the link to the recording and the certificate will be emailed. I've had a couple questions about that. And if you joined us via telephone, or if you don't receive these materials, just email me and we'll make sure that you get them. So I'm going to be reading aloud the questions, both for the benefit of Dr. Bethell, who can't see them because she's sharing her screen, but also for the benefit of people who will be watching the recording later. So the very first question I have is, it says, have there been any studies included with students who come from homes where English is not the predominant language spoken?
Yeah, actually, all the national data I showed you, we have for families where English is not their primary language. And so we're in the process of replicating that health affairs study for those families. And it's a mixed bag because often families who are less acculturated actually have stronger family connections and more resilience. And you see that. And so it's a interesting phenomenon, but there are. And I can share more about that, but also we run the Data Resource Center for Child and Adolescent Health and provide the data for every state where you can go in and look at ACEs by things like primary language of the home and whether or not it's English or non-English speaking Hispanic, and then a couple of other breakdowns. So you can see every variable I indicated on our Data Resource Center, which is childhealthdata.org. And in terms of the breadth of the research, there is less research, but there is increasing research on a lot of different cultures related to ACEs and buffers that help attenuate the impact and promote well-being.
So the next question that we have is, how did you measure relational health risk?
Yeah, so that's in the slides, so you can look at that later. And I hope in the paper I think it's going along pretty well. It should be published in October, but we did a lot of work. We had 18 different versions looking at everything we could in the National Survey of Children's Health. And the 4 things that we included in the relational risk were having 2 or more of the household level ACEs, which is already a very high bar, right? And then we included whether parents reported usually or always being very aggravated or angry at their child. And that is a very high indicator of course, most families don't report that, even if they may feel that way, because it's hard to get families to say they feel that way. But for those who do, it's a very high risk of relational well-being. The other is mothers who report not having the emotional and social support that they need, or most of the time not feeling like they're coping well with being a parent. All of those are very strongly linked in the research to the connection and attachment to the child.
So the next question that we have, it starts out with a comment. It says, great presentation. We've gotten a slew of those. So it says, yes, we need to change systems. Meanwhile, can you suggest some ways we might apply this info concretely in existing support groups for families? Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned before the importance of self-awareness of your own current well-being as it relates to adversity and flourishing, and then teaching skills that help us understand the growth mindset and the possibilities for becoming able to heal ourselves more and more. And as that happens, we have the opportunity to then engage more effectively in communities, in our workplaces, in our schools to promote that. You only have to be a little bit ahead of other people to start being a leader in this. So I think that wherever we are, we can begin with bringing this up and creating safe places to become self-aware, to start to understand the possibilities, to build skills and support systems wherever we are, and to bring out into the present and into our daily conversations what we've held absent, what we've held in, because anything held in is going to hurt us and our nervous systems and our communities. So that's the first thing I would say, is to begin to open up the dialogue, engage in safe self-reflection, understanding where we are, learning skills for healing ourselves, and then being active in whatever environments we're in to promote the educational process and the shifts in the systems that we do have impact over. And all of us have impact over something, even if it's just our own short, small environment.
Wonderful. Anybody else that has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box to me or to everyone. Another question that came through is...
You can also, by the way, look at the legislation that's out and decide what you like and be a voice. So that's the other thing every single person can do.
I love that.
Didn't want to miss that.
Yes, let's not miss that opportunity, both locally in the state of Tennessee and even with your metro councils and also federally. Yeah. So the next question we have is, in terms of billable services related to flourishing children, can you give some examples of where you've seen insurance companies bill for services that would contribute to those positive relational experiences?
Absolutely. I mean, the first is well visits, which are covered by the by every health plan, and we're trying to work on getting layers of well visit rates, payment rates stratified by the level of need that you find through the using a whole child assessment approach and whole child family approach, so that you can get paid more to do the more in-depth brief interventions and also linkages to the community. But right now there are models for enhanced payment for care coordination for families that you identify with social and relational factors. And the coding for well visits is starting to loosen up, but many health plans, Blue Cross, Aetna, many Medicaid programs are paying for stress management programs, parenting programs, and others that go into further depth than what you can do in a primary care setting, or that you might do in your schools or other settings through the brief interventions that you have in your interactions. So the coding issue is huge and something that we're working on a lot with health plan leaders and Medicaid to figure out what would it take for them to start to expand their payment in order to meet the need as we move through this transition and start to really do the proactive things that we do. But keep in mind the Bright Futures Guidelines, a center of it is to promote positive health and well-being and parent-child connection. And it's often not focused on because we're too busy collecting data in the visit, doing our screens, checking the boxes, and then not doing anything about it. And that doesn't make providers feel good either. They have a lot of moral injury and burnout. So being able to do some of the innovations, like I said before, of using pre-visit planning to engage families around their their agenda so that you can really engage them. And one of the phenomenon we have, I just want to make sure I say this, is that we often find problems or issues, but the families weren't engaged in naming it as their priority. So we refer and it doesn't work. It doesn't work to refer for services that people are not engaged in wanting. And so then we say, oh, it doesn't work to screen and refer. Well, it doesn't work if you don't partner with families and follow their lead of what they're wanting and what they're needing right now. So I do think that creating funding streams wherever we have global budgeting or capitated payments, we have a lot more flexibility. But that's that whole creating the conditions for community collaboration by putting resources in a place where the money can go where it's needed. So I say more about that, but right now, well visits are a powerful, under-optimized place. A lot of children don't go in, families don't know the value, and we can definitely do something there right away.
Excellent. It reminds me of one of the other articles in that special academic pediatrics journal, which is Nothing About Us Without Us.
Exactly, right, exactly. And we work with family voices every step of the way, have for like 25 years. So we'll keep doing that, working with the families. And that's really the centerpiece of the CAMI is family-driven and family-centered data and tools.
Perfect. We are at 12 o'clock Central Time, 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Dr. Bethell has graciously said that she would stick around to answer unanswered questions. So for those of you who need to leave, feel free to do that. You will still get your certificate, but for those of you who still want to hear her answer some of these questions, we'll go on for about 5 or 10 more minutes. So the next question I have is, how do we as parents prevent, mitigate, manage our own triggers from negatively affecting our children?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue for everyone, even the people who teach, how to sense into your own body and stress enough so that you can become aware of it before it becomes a response, so that you actually, a reaction, so that you're in a place of recognizing your own body and your own emotions, and then making choices about your response versus the trigger that happens when we're not able to do that. And that's a learned experience. That's actually not a moral attribute. It's actually learned. So your intention could be that, which of course it is, but then the stress comes and it just moves. And that's a phenomenon of how our brains work and our bodies got wired. So becoming very aware of your own sensations with compassion and building some of those stress management skills. And, it does involve deep breathing. It does involve reflection of emotions, even opening up emotions, not being aware. Like, we often have a very small emotional menu where we either feel kind of detached or angry. It's like really not a lot of the in between. And so we need to learn to become more sensitive to what we're experiencing. And when we've had our own trauma, we get disconnected from our body because that's how you survive. And so we really want to honor that and honor those adaptations, but at the same time, start to recognize them and shift them so they don't get perpetuated even when we don't want them to. And that's usually what happens. So families are really aware of these issues, but how can you heal yourself, that your well-being as a parent is absolutely central. I had that ACEs Connection article earlier on healing in place, and I actually link a number of resources for parents in there. And it's very important, I think, to look at your own lived experience and recognize that it's not a moral issue of whether you're good or bad. It's just an issue of becoming more aware of your own self, your feelings, working to get the support you need so that then you can get into this place of responding and not reacting in ways that are harmful to yourself and your children. So this is really a centerpiece of all parenting education, but there's so much you can do now on your own. There's a great book called Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel, who is the purveyor of interpersonal neurobiology, which basically is there's no me and you, there's only we, and how we're constantly infecting each other. So that's a good resource, but there's so many more resources, but it really hinges on awakening our own sensations of our body, emotions, recognizing in the moment, and then making responses that are different. And eventually the new patterns start to take effect. And you just see different ways of vocalizing and languaging with your child, with yourself. The story you're telling yourself in your head starts to shift where it's not so self-abusive and it's more, wow, okay, that I learned from that. Look at that. That impacted me, really upset me, but I'm looking at it. And therefore, I don't have to be held hostage to it, because that's our only choice when we're not opening up and making present what's been absent and having ways that we can navigate that. So I wish I could say so much more about that. That's actually an in-depth talk in itself and actually a long-term conversation. But there are a lot of resources for parents in particular right now.
Excellent. There's one comment I do want to read, and it says, this training is not only helpful for raising my own foster, biological, adoptive children, but also assists to improve my relationships with my spouse and coworkers. These models can be applied to all relationships in some manner. Thank you. So I just feel like that's the essence of what you're getting at. Another question is there any research project you're working on that Tennessee might be a participant?
Yeah, I mean, the work that we're trying to do to engage families in their own reflection and priority setting around the well visit is one of them. We have gone through randomized trials now, and we're basically in a process of wanting to create a launch and learn learning community, and the resources are free and you can use them. And they can be used in Head Start centers, home visiting, and that sort of thing, to make sure that when you're encountering and working with families, or even if you're a parent just yourself, that you have the opportunity to reflect and drive your own care in ways that really meet your needs. So that's one thing. The other is some of the measurement work. Depending on where you are, we want to be in a process of looking at enhancing measures for all age groups. And we have a lot of gaps in the 0 to 5 age group. And how do we measure flourishing and parent-child connection for that group? Because there's developmentally so many issues. So for anyone interested in not only measuring the positive health continuum, but also the outcomes for systems, you know, to start to look at how do we hold ourselves accountable in schools and healthcare and as Medicaid agencies or Title V agencies, how can we start to really move things by shifting our performance measures? So that's definitely one. And at the third would be really innovations in healing and trying to look at some of the evidence-based practices that haven't yet been brought in as practices widespread. And so it's very important that we start to bring in innovations. There's a number of innovations around using the arts and this healing through revealing and movement to start to work with kids early in life and their families. There's also innovations on brief child parent interventions, or how do you have conversations that are really effective in breaking that down? What makes up a relationship-centered encounter? And understanding what the training elements might be so that we can all learn those skills, which will help us heal too, because when you learn how to communicate better with others, you're automatically learning how to heal yourself and communicate better with yourself. So there's a lot of levels at that. And then the last would really be looking at policies and payment for people who are close to that edge, who are in a position to actually influence coding and payment and all of those things. There's a conversation that we're trying to have to link value-based purchasing and performance indicators and payment and training for practitioners, whether it's education, healthcare, or social services, so that they can be rewarded and supported to make the shifts.
All right, wonderful. So we have 3 more questions. The first is, and this is also in your slide deck, is there a website app you would recommend for staying on top of legislators to be a voice? And you mentioned CTIP. Do you want to talk about?
CTIP, I mean, CTIP, we started CTIP a number of years ago and are focusing on promoting education of policymakers. And then as that happens, the legislation naturally starts to take place because they wake up and they're like, wow, we have to do something about this. But there are search engines, and I just didn't get to do it for Tennessee, but I usually do it for every state I talk to. But you can look in your own Tennessee legislature to see what the bills are. They have websites that allow you to do that. And then I showed you a picture of the congressional federal legislation. So if you just typed in adverse childhood experiences or resilience or any words like that, you would find a lot. And I think it's really important that intelligence about where are the opportunities right now, because by the time something makes it to a proposal of a piece of legislation that will direct policy and resources, it's already gone through a lot. So often legislation comes up and it doesn't end up being voted in because it's a conversation starter, and then everybody starts talking together and eventually something happens. And being a part of that conversation is really, really important. And I think there's a lot of ears listening in the legislation at the state level, even the city and county level. They need a lot of support. So there's search engines for that, and you can find them, and I can help you find them if you can't.
Excellent. And you can also, we do this with TCCY a lot, where we compile legislation affecting children. So please do feel free to join our list serve as well. But Tennessee is among one of the top websites for user, like just being user friendly for finding your representative, finding bills, and just like she said with the federal website, you could just type in ACEs or resilience and they'll bring up all past legislation filed, past as in PAST, not past as in it's past, but that's been filed, and you can peruse that. So another question, do you feel that children are being misdiagnosed with ODD and ADHD due to parent stress as a result of dealing with children?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big conversation, but if we had a diagnosis called developmental trauma disorder, which has all the symptoms of a lot of our mental, emotional, behavioral problems that are natural outcomes from trauma, we would be diagnosing a lot of developmental trauma disorder and not all of those other diagnoses. So it's tender because once enough trauma has occurred that it has affected the biologic and nervous system, there can be a really strong support for some medication for that. And of course the therapy, but not if it's not trauma informed and flourishing oriented, we miss a lot of opportunities. So right now I showed you an article of, is it ADHD or is it trauma? And I think the research is showing it's really hard to tell, because if you take ACEs out of the equation, the rates go down so much that it already is a strong indicator that it is the adversity and the trauma and the way the relationships occur for children that have put them in a place of having those symptoms. So I think that, you know, we give things names because that's what we can code and bill for. That's why we're trying to change, you know, coding to include developmental trauma disorder, which actually can be defined. There's a lot of research because it would be a co-diagnosed piece. And when it's ever co-diagnosed, you have to deal with the foundation of the trauma and the healing. And when you do that, often there are dramatic improvements in the symptoms quickly, which then call into question the whole thing. And so there's no question that there's no separation between the emotions and the brain and the body. And so when we can affect that, we see the effect, and it really is threatening the core biological model of medicine, especially in mental health. So there's a lot going on here, and I think that a lot of providers are really wanting to not just diagnose and treat without being aware, but we have a long way to go. So big voices need to happen in that. It's science-based to change it. So yes, I do think that's happening, and I think that we need a lot of action to not shame children, just treat them biologically and not address the core. I've seen horrible, horrible things happen to young people who have that happen to them. Their identities are destroyed. Their shame levels are off the charts, and they may never recover.
Man, yes.
I hate to say that, but what I mean is without something changing, they won't recover. There's dropping out of high school, giving up on life early, being so shamed that they're bad. And we do that. We do that to them. Instead of saying, I can see you're having some difficulties. How can I help? Or, you know, the possibility of developing positive flourishing, even if you have those other issues. Again, the dual continuum.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much. Very last question, and I know that it's definitely not an easy one, but it's a relevant one. Mm-hmm. Considering the current awareness of racial injustice, do you feel that there will be more attention placed on the impact of racism on medical and behavioral conditions in an effort to achieve healing and wellness?
Absolutely. I mean, belonging is our number one need. And when people feel like they somehow are not belonging in the society that they're in, there's I don't know if you know about the blue zones of happiness studies that go on. You know, they create those blue zones, who's the happiest in the world. Well, first of all, America isn't very happy, but the factors that really dictate how people feel in general in a society. One of them is whether you feel like you're living in a just culture and society that cares about you. And when you feel like that's not happening, happiness goes down no matter what your other conditions are, rich, poor, other factors. It's huge. So absolutely. And we have long been an advocate for that. And it's a trauma. It's a trauma. And if you experience not belonging, it doesn't matter what's happening by the objective eye. It matters what your experience is. And if you've had any time in your life of experiencing racism and it's been internalized, it perpetuates, it grows. And small things even can trigger that, like I said before. So it doesn't matter what is actually happening. It just matters the experience. So having that experience of not belonging in the culture that you're in, or not feeling treated justly, or giving the opportunities that other people get, or you have to modify your behavior just to not trigger somebody else's abuse of you, it takes up a lot of energy, and it's keeping our system and our brains in fight or freeze. And so absolutely have to deal with that as a core issue for trauma at every level, and one of the first things to address in order to promote flourishing.
Excellent. We will end on that answer. Dr. Bethell, thank you again, not just for presenting to us, but for pursuing this research and contributing to everybody's knowledge on how we can better support
children. And
children.
I'd love to see the other questions and comments if you can share them with me.
I would be happy to do that.
Maybe I can offer a little more, but I'd just like to see that as I put my slides together. Maybe I'll add a few resource slides or something based on that. So if you can share them, that'd be great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, thank you. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank you so much.